this was good enough. Without having about that 168-minute long engine bleed conditioning. So if you're talking about an L- clock, we're probably significantly more than 10 minutes on an L- clock. So just to point that out. But then again, we'll wait and see what they decide to do. But what I meant was they haven't finished filling the ICPS yet. They haven't got into stable replenish on the ICPS yet. So it would make sense for them to continue to stay in this configuration versus just stop and detank right now. But again, if I was betting on this, I would bet that we're going to stop before we start counting again and come back another day. But like I said, I'm not in control. We'll have to see what they decide to do.
So just to recap, so the issue that they have failed to troubleshoot and would likely need to detank to do further troubleshooting won't prevent them from accomplishing a couple more objectives, namely finishing loading on the upper stage, but it would prevent them from releasing the T-10 hold and entering terminal count.
Yes, I believe so. Just hopefully this it makes it a little bit clearer. Even if they had just fixed this and the valve was now reseating, they would still have, again, some large percentage of that 168-minute long chill down to perform. So we could still be looking at maybe a couple of hours of chill down to do sitting here with the clock stopped at 10 minutes. So, but they, since they didn't fix it, we're probably looking at, what else can we do in this configuration before we call it a day. I mean, I know I'm being pessimistic here, but this is not the kind of thing, generally speaking, that you would just continue with, especially if it's the core stage versus the second stage, the ICPS. So I wouldn't expect them to continue unless they resolve this leak.
Right, gotcha. So we've got some questions coming in here, and so while we sit around and wait for another update as the teams look if they have any other options to troubleshoot that particular seal on the core stage, while also continuing to load the upper stage with liquid hydrogen, we're going to go ahead and dive into some more questions here. First one from Emmett, and this is a shuttle question, so I know Chris and Philip will be well inclined to answer. Will the SLS make those barking/howling noises like Shuttle did during fueling?
The what?
I think they might be talking about, wasn't there like an APU noise during the countdown?
Yes. So right around, in a shuttle count, right around 5 minutes, you would start the auxiliary power units, and you would hear like this chugging sound. Basically, like the vehicle was coming alive, and then at around T-14 seconds, you would hear this sustained whine that would sort of start from the vehicles, and those were the booster hydraulic power units doing their things, and everything as well. SLS does have core stage auxiliary power units that will be started during the terminal count as well. I would not see any reason why you would not hear those. They're very similar to the ones that were used in the shuttle program in that regard, as they are not electric in any way, shape, or form like that. So I would expect SLS to make some similar noises in that regard to the hydraulic systems spooling up. Yeah.
We just have to hope that NASA lets the microphone audio into the feed.
Yes,
that would be something. Again, I don't know. Again, this is us evil media people have been complaining about a lack of commentary, and so we really appreciate that they are providing this commentary today. But it's still a restricted feed, so we would hear that chugging if if we had a microphone out at the launch pad for this test, the APUs will come up at T-minus 4 minutes, and they'll be running that whole time. They didn't do it for green run. I don't believe we were able to hear that, but you've got the same. You need that same amount of hydraulic muscle to gimbal the engines, and then also for all the engine valve control stuff too. So I don't expect to hear it on this one, but it's not because it's not there.
Another question coming in here from Oliver, who asks, how much will SLS weigh once it is fully fueled? Do we have a complete wet mass for SLS?
Let me see if we can find
hang on, we can find that, yeah.
I was going to say, is that something we have to search real quick?
Yeah.
So
let's
we can talk about this a little bit while they look up the actual number. We'll get that for you, Oliver. Worth noting that the vehicle does get transported out with a fair amount of mass already on board, because those two solid rocket boosters are fully casted with their solid propellants before they even arrive in Florida. The mass that changes during the actual countdown here is the core stage fuel, liquid hydrogen, and liquid oxygen, which of course there is a lot of. I mean, look how big the stage is. And then also your ICBS up top gets fuel. Orion will already have its stored propellants on board and things like that. Obviously, during the countdown, during a crude launch, humans will step aboard, but the mass of a human is pretty negligible in this sense. But it is actually fairly heavy before they even get into anything else. But once it is fully fueled, gentlemen, have we got a wet mass looked up?
It is, yes. It is an approximately 6.5 million pound rocket that will leave the pad.
There we go, 6.5 million pounds. Do we have a thrust figure for the 4 RS-25s and the 2 solids combined?
8.8 million pounds of thrust.
So 8.8 divided by 6.5 is a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.35, and that's not small.
So actually, then the mass might be slightly less than that, because its total thrust-to-weight ratio should be about 1.5. So I'm not far off on that. So it's about a 6.5 million pound vehicle, give or take the payload that's on board it, basically.
Gotcha. Okay, so maybe closer to 6 million. That 1.5 thrust-to-weight ratio is pretty fast. It's basically higher thrust-to-weight ratio is the quicker the vehicle will accelerate off of the pad. If you look at something like a Minotaur or something that's just a solid rocket motor, that's very high thrust, and the rocket jumps off the pad, right? Because throw back to that one Minotaur launch from Walsh that DOS freaked out about because of how fast it was. But SLS will actually jump off the pad pretty quickly, and that's because of those 2 giant solid rocket boosters that it had.
Yes, indeed. Those things provide one heck of a punch when they ignite. Yeah.
Yes. Keeping the questions coming here, Outdoorsman asked, are 2 of the RS-25 engines from STS-135 and 1 of 2 were used on John Young's last flight? Do we have the RS-25 history in front of us, one of us, or do we have to look that up too? I know we have it somewhere.
We have it. Hang on. Okay. I know Daryl Nail went through this. One of the engines, yeah. I mean, the engines have a pretty big storied history to them. A few were used on STS-125, but 1 was used on the last flight of the orbiter, Endeavour, and everything like that. Here it is. The history of the RS-25s that will launch Artemis 1. That's what I was looking for. Just give me a second to pull it up. Okie dokie. They have... okay. So, engine number 2040. So, 1 engine... is the biggest veteran with 12 flights to its name. Its first flight was STS-89 in January of 1998 aboard the shuttle Endeavour's mission to Mir.
Wow.
And the last flight of that engine was STS-135 with Atlantis on the final flight of the shuttle program, and also flew with John Glenn's flight in 95. Engine 256, which is engine number 2, on SLS, has 4 flights to its credit, including STS-114's return to flight after Columbia. Engine 258 is engine number 3. It has 6 flights, including STS-128, which took Fico Sang, the first Swedish astronaut, into orbit. And then engine number 4 is engine 1060. It has 3 flights to its name, including the last shuttle flight on STS-135. All told, these engines have flown 21 successful shuttle flights over 3 decades of operations. So that's all 4 of them together have flown 21 missions over 3 decades.
There we go. And of course, that goes for the first couple Artemis missions. We'll use R-25 engines that have flight proven, if you will. And then they'll gradually phase in the new build engines once they have used up the flight inventory of engines that are to be reused on SLS.
Indeed they do.
I'm going to keep some questions coming here. Again, if you have questions, please tag us with @NASA Spaceflight in chat. I've got some more questions in the queue already, and we're going to keep going through these. I also want to acknowledge the people that are supporting the stream with their super chats, and some of these are questions as well. Justin Valenti, really quick with a super chat. Thank you so much for your support. 2 questions. 1, what are the 4 cylinders on the course section of stage 2? Have to figure out what exactly you might be looking at there. Also, the red tape looks to be a little. Oh, I know what the engine camera one is. Okay, if we get a cycle back, and this is for
yes.
Yeah,
if,
the red tape,
if they show the engine section view again, I want to jump to that because I know what he's talking about there.
Yeah, the red. Just so you know, since we've been looking at it all day, the red pipe is actually There's a whole bunch of different water systems that line the mobile launcher. So the red one is basically a fire extinguishing. It's called fire extinguishing system. So we don't want to see those pipes. We don't want to see water coming out of those because that means the engines have shut down on the pad and they're cooling the engines down. The water deluge pipes are actually slightly out of the picture for the most part. I mean, there are some big pipes in the flame hole that the engines are hanging over. But hopefully we'll get that operational TV camera shot here again pretty soon. But yeah, you can see that red hose, and there's a bunch of water nozzles hanging off the end of it, and that's one of the FireX water lines. And they have those, they're all over the umbilical tower in case you were to get some sort of a hydrogen. The reason that they stop and are real careful if they see any indication of a hydrogen leak is because if that was to ignite, you can have a fire, which hydrogen burns clear. You can't really see it unless you're looking at a thermal image. And so they've got these water lines that they're going to spray onto whatever they can to try and knock down a fire if they can.
Yeah, and to be clear about this, because I think a lot of people would probably be wondering, like, oh, but what's, come on, like, when's the last time a hydrogen fire occurred, right? And the answer to that is it happened in Japan just a few years ago with their H-2B rocket when it was counting down and fueling the launch of an H-2B resupply spacecraft to the International Space Station. There was a hydrogen leak and a resulting fire on the launch pad. Thankfully, they faced it all and nothing bad happened, and the mission launched several weeks later. But yes, there was a hydrogen leak and fire on the pad of Hiroshima a few years ago. So even when you have a lot of experience with it, you stop and you take it very seriously because you have a lot of experience with it.
Some more support that has come in here. Tommy Vasquez with Super Chat support. Appreciate that as always. Neo, here's a great question. As for the crewed Artemis missions, will the crew have to board before propellant loading and wait for 6 hours? Where in the countdown do astronauts get aboard Orion?
Great question. So they will. This will go very much like the Space Shuttle and Atlas V, which we just saw for Starliner last month, in which SLS will be fueled prior to the crew going out to the launch pad. So part of this is So part of this, right, is that the countdown for Artemis 1 will be slightly different than the countdown for Artemis 2 because you will have to account for the crew needing to go out and get the vehicle. Now, the way you normally do that is you put your full load of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen into the vehicle, in this case for SLS. And then a team will go out to assess the conditions of the vehicle as the crew then leaves the operations and checkup building and goes to the pad to get into Orion. That is usually timed for, depending on how much hold time and wiggle room you want to build into your countdown, it can either be pretty quickly afterward or an hour or so after you go into a state of replenish. But that's going to be the generalized timeline that they follow once crew are added to the equation for SLS.
Gotcha.
And that actually, hang on one moment. Sorry. That actually has to do with crew time on back limits. So there is a limit when you are in your pressure suits and you are in the vehicle for how long the human body can be on its back and waiting for a liftoff in that regard. And that is actually what drives some of the countdown requirements, not so much for SLS because it's got launch windows that it has to meet. But if you go back into the shuttle program and you hear, oh, it's a mission launching a random science flight that doesn't have to hit a window or a specific orbital plane, we have a 2.5-hour window to launch. That's because of the crew time on back being in the orbiter. So that does become a limiting factor when the launch windows are long enough to potentially allow that consideration to come into play.
There we go. Thank you for the in-depth shuttle knowledge from both of you. I know that it's going to become very relevant in all of this SLS coverage, so we appreciate it as always.
We haven't held on to it for nothing.
Yeah. Going to keep some more questions coming here, and we've got one from Jonathan saying, after a successful wet dress rehearsal, what does the timeline look like for SLS? So we know they're still working on this wet dress attempt. It looks like there is potentially the chance that they will have to recycle and do it another time. Not sure they're going to complete everything this attempt, but we'll keep the updates coming. But once the wet dress hurdle is passed, whether that's today, whether that's a couple of days from now, whether it's in a couple months, whatever, what are the steps that go after that as far as launch readiness goes, Philip?
They will, and in fact, it was in the story that we talked about today. Of course, it was based on this going a little more smoothly than it has. But they'll basically prepare the vehicle to roll back to the VAB, and they'll roll back to the VAB and get it ready for launch. And there's probably about a month of work. It's just that they know that they have to do. And the reason that they don't want to just say, well, we'll be ready to launch a month after wet dress is because they don't know what other things that they're going to have to do after this test. So again, we're seeing stuff like there's a few things like this hydrogen leak that they'll have to fix in order to finish the test. They may find some other things. We were hearing that they had an issue with the crew access arm, for instance. This is what you would see for any crewed launch with Orion for SLS. You'd see the crew access arm would be up against the hatch all the way up until, I believe, 6 minutes before liftoff, and then they pull it back. But for this flight, because there's no crew on board, they had planned on retracting it back on either Friday or Saturday before the countdown started, but they weren't able to do that. And we heard from public affairs, they just decided to leave the arm extended for this test. There's no issue with doing that, but they are going to have to retract it for launch, and they're also going to have to retract it just to roll back. So whatever issue they're having, they're going to have to address probably when they get back to the VIP. So that's one of those extra tasks that they already know that they're going to have to deal with. And we also just don't know what else we're going to see. Again, when they do this terminal count, they may be able to get all the way down to they may be able to get all the way through it, and they may find just some things that they want to tweak, and those could be software tweaks. But then even for that, you need to go and you need to do some testing to make sure that those changes are going to work well across the ground systems and then the vehicle systems as well. So there's about a month worth of just getting the system ready to go. Most of that would be in the VAB, and then there would be maybe a week and a half worth of time once they get back out on the pad to get ready. But they were talking about doing a little bit more of a faster pace to things. So if they had been able to get this test done today. They were talking about rolling back a week from today. So, we'll just have to see, because obviously they're still having issues with ground equipment here that they need to deal with. And so something like a hydrogen leak, unless they come up with some way to do this remotely, they're probably going to be out there for a little while trying to fix that, and then get ready and get back into testing again and do this again. They had planned on just doing a practice scrub turnaround after this, but again, that was predicated on a relatively clean test, and so it isn't really going to make a lot of sense for them to just turn around and get ready. They were talking about potentially a 48-hour recycle test or a 72-hour recycle test, but you can't really do that if you need to take apart some mechanisms, look for a leak, maybe like tighten bolts like they did on the last on the previous leak, and then button it back up and get ready to tank again. So we'll just have to see. We'll have to see what happens here in the interim, because everybody wants to start talking about, okay, what's left for launch? Well, really, this is the big hurdle. They need to finish this test, and in a way, these little issues that they're having, I don't know, little issues, but imagine if these were launch attempts, and we were getting ready to launch, and then they scrubbed and they had to roll back and come back out 2 months later to try another launch attempt again. So part of the reason that they did this in the first place is because they've never done it before, and the idea was let's go through this, screen all the issues that we can get out of the system. It doesn't guarantee that they might not find something when they come to a real launch attempt, but the idea was let's test the whole system from end to end. And this is really focusing on the ground systems, because Orion's been heavily tested up at Plumbrook. The core stage was Dennis in 2020 and 2021. And so this is really all getting the whole vehicle together, but also testing it with all the ground systems. And so they need, this is what the point of these tests was to make sure that the entire ground system and then the ground system connected to the rocket, that they all work together in this sort of choreography for a countdown. So we're still waiting. This is a big hurdle that they need to get over before they're ready to start really thinking heavily about launch.
All right, gotcha. We've got a bunch of questions coming in because we started talking about when crew onboarding, or crew loading, whatever the right word is, crew ingress. Thank you, brain. Occurs during the countdown. We've got a bunch of other questions about how the crew will interface with the rocket during the countdown, things like that. So let's try and grab some of these. Let's see. First one, how will the astronauts get on the mobile launcher for boarding? I know that they just NASA awarded a contract recently for the vehicle that they'll ride out to the pad on. Once they get to the pad, how do you get up on the mobile launcher?
Yeah, so if you actually look at a photograph of Pad B without the SLS there, you can see that there are, despite the fact that we call it the same pad, there are still interfaces that are there, right? There's the huge water systems, the propellant systems, all of those things. But there's also a little tower off on the west side of the pad deck. And
which is opposite the current camera view, right?
Which is opposite the current camera view, yes. Directly opposite it, so you can see there's a little structure that has one elevator that brings you up to the mobile launcher levels. From there, they would have to get off that elevator, walk onto the deck of the mobile launcher, walk over to the actual launcher tower, and then get on that elevator to go up to the crew access level. So very similar to how the Apollo crews used to do it with the Saturn V, where they had to transfer elevators as well. We got spoiled by that during the shuttle program, and then obviously ULA and SpaceX obviously just have the one single tower because of their pad systems and how they work. So it's a little different for SLS, but it's just you have to get on one elevator, get off on the mobile launcher's zero deck, flip your rocket, and then get on the other.
It's all tied in with whether you brought your crew access tower with you or not, basically.
Basically, yes. Did you bring the crew access tower with you or not? I like that.
Because if so, you need to first get on the tower that you brought with you, and then you can actually get on the tower itself.
That might be a merch idea, the NSF version of always check your stage. Did you bring the crew tower with you?
Bring your own crew tower? The other questions coming in here, is the launch escape system the only way the crew can get off the pad quickly, or do they still have that bucket zipline thing?
So there is no zipline thing right now because there's a crew and on SLS, and they have not been sending out red team members to the pad to go up and down that tower during fueling. So for Artemis 1, we don't need it because we're not going to have anyone out there when the vehicle is fueled, which is when you would need that rapid escape system, basically from the pad. That is coming, and that will be added ahead of Artemis 2 so that the crew, if there were to be an RS-25 engine shutdown or some type of a hydrogen leak that necessitated the very quick evacuation of the launch pad while the crew access arm were still extended, that would be their escape route. At a certain point, the launch escape system is launch abort system. Sorry, it's the launch abort system, LAS for Artemis. Although launch escape system and launch abort system are pretty much interchangeable, but it's called the launch abort system for SLS. So my apologies for mispronouncing or saying that. But basically, right before the crew access arm is retracted, the LAS, the launch abort system, will be activated on Artemis 2 and beyond. It is inert for Artemis 1. And then if there were an emergency after that point, which necessitated a pad abort scenario, the engines would fire on the launch abort system tower and yank Orion and the crew away from SLS and then pitch them out for a landing in the Atlantic, about 1.5 kilometers offshore is what they aim for here. Maybe a little bit farther with SLS, 1.5 kilometers is what they aim for Dragons and Starliners, so it might be a little bit further for SLS given that it has a bigger
test
boom
flight
radius.
of NASA's Orion spacecraft around the moon and back on the rocket that you see there on the pad, the Space Launch System. Okay, so it's official. The NASA test director told the ground launch sequencer to cancel the T0 time. So we are extending this hold. It's being extended while the hydrogen team continues to work a leak that popped up more than an hour ago. Let's update you on 4 tanks, 2 massive tanks inside the core stage and the 2 tanks in the upper stage. We are filling them with super chilled propellants, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen. Currently, core stage LOX is in stop flow, and that is planned because they're working a couple of tests, and they're going to reinitialize fill. The core stage liquid hydrogen is also in stop flow. That's because they're troubleshooting the hydrogen leak. The upper stage hydrogen is also in stop flow because of the same reason, troubleshooting. Right, well, correction. The LOX core stage is in replenish. It is the LOX upper stage, which is in a stop flow, that is doing a planned functional test of the vent relief valve. So again, go over them again. Core stage, LOX tank is in replenish. Core stage hydrogen in stop flow while we troubleshoot. Upper stage hydrogen in stop flow for the same reason. Liquid oxygen in the upper stage in stop flow for a planned functional test. I want to talk a little bit about the issue that the team is trying to correct, and that is the hydrogen leak. If you look on your screen, we'll talk about exactly where this problem is. You look at the rocket, come down the rocket to the bottom of the rocket, and then look to the left. The left of the rocket is the tail service mast umbilical, which contains a lot of flex hoses, which you can see naturally droop in the middle as they connect to the bottom of the rocket. Those flex hoses, they carry propellants and gases in and out of the rocket. The droop of the flex hoses, that's normal. When the rocket launches, those flex hoses, which are connected to the rocket by quick disconnect lines, they separate. One half stays with the rocket and the other with the flex hoses that are connected to the tail service mast. And so the issue is with the quick disconnect that is right at the base of the rocket, the liquid hydrogen bleed line, which carries the hydrogen off the rocket after it's circulated through the main propulsion system and the engines for pre-chill and kickstart bleed. It then goes back out and then out to a flare stack and is burned off. So it's that point that's connected right there at the bottom of the rocket. That's where they continue to work on coming up with ideas to fix a leaky seal in that quick disconnect line. They're talking about doing one more attempt. The first attempt to fix it did not work out. They warmed up the quick disconnect and then cooled it back down, hoping that the seal would reseat. It didn't work out. Now they're going to pressurize the area and hope that kind of reseats the seal. And so that's where we're at right now. Again, no T0 at this moment. Stand by as I'll listen to the teams continue to work this issue, and we'll have updates for you as soon as they are available. For now, this is Artemis Launch Control.
Okay, so to recap that update there, teams are still working to see if they've got any options regarding that seal on the core stage. They are going to extend the hold past the 30-minute, a planned 30-minute hold, which is expected. This is not a scrub for the day, to be very clear. I mentioned that they canceled the old T0. That just means that original T0, which was like, 4:38 or something, which obviously is only 2 minutes from now. Clearly that wasn't going to happen. That T0 has been ruled out officially, but they have not ruled out getting into terminal count if they can work around this issue and see if they can solve the solution. Sounds like they're going to try and repressurize the area to make another attempt at reseating that seal. So the teams will keep working on that, and they'll keep giving us updates as they work through it. But right now, still at T-minus 10 minutes and holding to see if they can resolve that issue. Sounds like everything else that they have been working on earlier in the countdown has been resolved, though. They did also mention, what was the test they mentioned with ICBS? It looks like there was a planned test of a valve that required them stopping filling for a little bit.
It sounded to me like when they that this is in reaction to the issue that they saw earlier, and they're just taking time to do some troubleshooting, even though there isn't an issue to get more data. Because what they indicated when they were transitioning between hydrogen and oxygen on the upper stage, they noticed a surge in pressure in the oxygen lines, so they stopped. And if you remember, like, they were talking about pressure a couple months ago in the liquid oxygen lines and preventing anti-vortex protection there in regard to the core stage. And what they said in regard to the upper stage today for its liquid oxygen pressure surge is that the way they got around it, the way they fixed it, was to manually control some of the valves and manually move them into different configurations, which would alter the pressures in the core stage, but would not violate any of the pressure limits there on either end, either high or low. And now what they're saying is that they have voluntarily stopped liquid oxygen flow into the intercryogenic propulsion stage and are doing troubleshooting on some of those valves. So it did not sound at all like there was an issue, just that they're trying to gain and gather more data on that system and how the valves are responding and operating and how the pressures are changing in the system, since they have the time to do so in this test.
I was just listening. I just rolled the NASA stream back, and he was talking about they're doing a test. He specifically talked about a vent relief valve for the ICPS, and that's they're all the tanks have vent valves. Since you're constantly boiling off propellant, and you have to let that gas vent, and then up at the top, and you're then putting more propellant in at the bottom. So they were planning on doing tests like this for both stages, and so I think they picked up the core stage test during the last tanking back in April, and they may have done some more of this, repeated that test today at some point. But this is the first time that they've loaded the ICPS, and so that does give them some confidence in that system. At least so far, it seems to be leak tight, and it seems to be functioning nominally. So that's useful data, obviously, for the next time that they do this test. And hopefully, the one problem that we seem to have when we have a gaseous nitrogen issue is because it's at the very beginning of the day. We lost almost 2 hours again. This time that problem was not with Air Liquide or Liquide. I think the unfortunate thing is that we're all butchering their name. But they have two gaseous nitrogen supply legs. One of them also comes from a facility on the Space Center grounds called the Converter Compressor Facility, I think, the CCF. And they actually leaned on that in the test in April when they lost the main flow from Air Liquide. And so, but today, before they could get started, they lost the backup flow from the converter compressor facility, and they won't start until they've got redundancy. So the problem is again, it takes a lot of time to kind of reconfigure the system, the purge. And so, since we started almost 2 hours late, that's going to take that's taking that time off the end of the window today for the launch team. And so at some point, the launch team's been here all day. So they were here at 6 a.m. Eastern when they had the pre-tanking meeting, or at least getting ready to go. And so they will probably knock off here at some point and hand off to another team. Maybe not quite yet, but especially if they're not ready to, if they're still dealing with this leak for a while, the end of their sort of work shift is going to come up here pretty soon. I'm trying to think of that question that we were asked. So there you can see the FireX, that red FireX line. But I don't know what the other, because they were talking about cylinders, and the only
T-minus minutes holding.
Yep.
I want to recap again the status of the 4 propellant tanks on the rocket. The core stage liquid hydrogen tank and the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank are both in stop flow while the launch team troubleshoots a hydrogen leak. The core stage liquid oxygen tank is currently in replenish and stable state. The upper stage liquid oxygen tank is in stop flow for a planned test of the vent relief valve. Again, both sides of the hydrogen tanks, upper and lower, both in stop flow for troubleshooting a hydrogen leak. Core stage liquid oxygen is in replenish. Upper stage liquid oxygen is in stop flow for a test of the vent relief valve. And we're currently without a T0 time, as the launch director allows the liquid hydrogen team to continue to work troubleshooting. This is Artemis Launch Control.
There we go. So that's another update there. Working on a hydrogen leak. It's kind of like on the upper stage. Did I hear that? Copy that right?
No, I think we still have the core stage leak, but they've stopped flow for hydrogen to both stages because those propellant lines are interconnected. So
okay.
He's I think just trying to clarify what's going on with the vehicle. Although I think I'd say at this point, they're basically, they've got a list of test objectives for this test. There's the sort of a prime core set of test objectives that they will only get if they can pick up the clock at 10 minutes. Eventually they're going to do that, but they probably aren't going to be able to do that today.
Right.
But they're going to continue to tick off as many of the test objectives that they can, because it takes a lot of work to get into this configuration, just having the vehicle in relatively full and in stable replenish, or very close to it. So that's just, again, one of those things. So when you stop flow to the hydrogen tanks, they're continuing to boil off, and so even just to condition those tanks to get ready to pick up the clock again, there's an amount of time that you have to take to to top the tanks off, get back into stable replenish, and then sit there for a little while, because what's happening is when you let it just boil off, the hydrogen is warming up slowly, since they're insulated tanks, but the hydrogen is warming up, and so the replenish also has the effect of bringing the bulk temperature of the hydrogen down, which is generally what you want. You want to condition the hydrogen so it's colder and more dense. Also, just again, so you can run the engines for longer if you need to. So there are a bunch of different things going on here, and so really what they're doing at this point is they're just trying to achieve as many test objectives as they can, and then we'll see again if they're able to configure the tail service mass in this quick disconnect valve and say, okay, we can proceed with one terminal countdown attempt. I imagine that they would be willing to do that. At the outset today, they were talking about 2 terminal countdown runs, and even with the delays today, they were talking about a 2-hour test window for those runs between 4:40 p.m. Eastern and 6:48 p.m. Eastern, or thereabouts. So we still have, we're just about in that, at the beginning of that, hypothetical window right now. So in theory, they would still have time, perhaps, to make one run, and then you might start thinking about, okay, one of the media questions that came up in one of these teleconferences was, if you ever got into a situation where you could only do one run, would you consider doing that? And then basically saying, okay, we got enough test objectives so that we would take these other problems that we have and just take them back to the VAB and deal with those in the VAB and get the vehicle ready to launch at the same time. So, I'm sure they would be willing to at least have that conversation today if they could get into a position to do that. But, that remains to be seen.
Right. All right, we've got a bunch of questions that have continued to come through here, so while we continue to provide updates, and also thank you to NASA and their commentaries for their updates as well that we're relaying, as long as they keep coming. Yeah.
Yes. It has been wonderful to know what is happening with the vehicle on a regular basis. So kudos to NASA for the course correction on that.
Yeah,
very much appreciated.
But I do also want to keep with the question answering, because that's what we like to do around here, and we can do that. And we were talking about some of the crew aspects earlier. We were also talking about the launch abort system. So really quick, some of these questions are pretty quick ones here. Does the launch abort system work even before first stage ignition? Basically, what's the earliest possible point where a pad abort would actually take place using the launch abort system? And then but then obviously in flight, but what's the earliest point that a pad abort could actually occur? Versus
I believe it is when you pull the Coraxis arm back, because other than that is in the way of a successful clean separation. So very much like SpaceX arms the launch abort system and then pulls the arm back, right? And they do that in rapid succession. There, it gets activated, and then your arm gets pulled back, but then the software logic goes, okay, the arm is back. Now, if I need to, I can fire it. But it's also worth noting that, like, the way this would work is like, okay, so you pull the access arm back, you've got an active launch abort system that can do a pad abort at that point with Orion. But that doesn't mean that if anything goes wrong with the rocket, even an engine ignition startup issue that results in poor RS-25 shutting down on the pad, which in shuttle was called a redundant set launch sequencer abort, or RSLS abort. I'm not certain if that's what they're still calling it in Artemis, for the Artemis program, but you don't necessarily like ignite the launch abort system just because you have an engine failure, because pad aborts can happen in relative safety where your crew is fine, and then you can save the vehicle and they can just walk out across the crew access arm when the closeout crew comes to get them. So it's a little tricky answer and it's a litlittle complicated, but it's basically correct. Pullback is when you have that pad abort capability, but you don't always take it. It is still very dependent on what the issue with the rocket is after that point, as to whether or not the system would ignite to pull you away.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Right, and you would get just a couple of notes. So I believe they're still baselining Artemis 2 launch operations, but I believe the crew access arm would retract at T-minus 6 minutes for Artemis 2. At least that was the baseline. So in that time frame, and just another thing to point out, obviously, you have automated logic to fire the abort tower under certain situations, but then obviously you have a crew on board who also has a man. It's probably a very similar thing to Apollo. It's like there's a handle that the commander is holding that to fire the launch abort system manually if he or she chooses to do that. But like Chris said, that's a decision you really don't want to make unless you're out of options. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Some more questions that have come through here. Here's a quick one. James asking, does SpaceX have to clear 39A for 39B white dress operations? I believe, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the pad doesn't actually have to be clear, but I don't think they're permitted to do their own hazardous ops in parallel. Like a Falcon 9 couldn't be fueled at the same time.
That is correct. And that actually is not an issue between the two pads. The pads are too close to one another so the vehicles can't be fueled together. It's an emergency response issue for the Cape. And in terms of what emergency responders have to be planning for, because if you had an unfortunate situation where you had two rockets fueled at the same time, and both of them encountered different issues that emergency teams had to respond to, you can't overstretch your emergency response team. So a lot of this comes down to that. Now, there is also some things, because Pad A and Pad B share nitrogen facilities, and nitrogen is needed for inerting the vehicles and keeping them safe. The SLS, the sheer amount of nitrogen that it uses, does affect the nitrogen supply to 39A. So there is that consideration as well. But depending on what SpaceX would be trying to do there, they might not have the nitrogen supply to do it if SLS is doing something itself. But you are correct that the pads do not have to be evacuated for just a fueling attempt. I do, however, believe that 39A is within the blast radius if you intend to go skyward with SLS. And that would have an effect on Pad A operations. Just because the sheer blast area that SLS could have, right, as it goes up with those twin solid rocket boosters. But in terms of just fueling it, operations can continue at Pad A and vice versa.
Right. All right, keep the questions coming here. We've also got some super chat questions here. Yo-Man asks, will SLS launch if the timer reaches 0? I know the answer to this is no, but it does prompt a more in-depth question. Basically, what's the difference when you program the rocket for a wet dress rehearsal versus an actual launch attempt? Like, is the programming actually the same and you just command an abort beforehand? Or is it you program it differently so that obviously the rocket doesn't actually launch when it finishes the terminal attempt?
Great question. You basically remove the parts of the countdown sequence after the cutoff point. So you write a program that's similar. Right. But of course, they've got test objectives they're not going to be doing during the actual launch campaign. So the software is slightly different, but not appreciably different, if that makes sense. It's not like we have to go test the software throughout the entirety of the system. right? It's not that much of a difference. And they've already done that, to be fair. But basically, you tell the count, okay, you tell the software, okay, we're going to cut off here. But the software doesn't have anything else beyond that. Like, it doesn't have software codes to ignite the engines. It doesn't have software codes to open the valves and the engines to start the flow of propellants, which is why we cut off at T-minus 9.34 seconds. Because it's very specific as to the cutoff point, and it's designed to cut off before you open the propellant valves into the RS-25s, where you would have to be concerned with drying them out in a scrub turnaround, which is going to take weeks. So basically, you just write it so that there's no possibility of going further than what you intend. And SpaceX does a very similar thing and uses a very similar system when they static fire the Falcon 9s, because obviously they are static firing past when the intended T0 time would be. So they just eliminate the part of the software that says release the vehicle from the launch pad, right? And that's a very similar thing with SLS. You just don't go past, and you don't have the software written that can actually ignite the engines, and worse, ignite the solid rocket boosters. But none of the pyrotechnics have been installed in the booster rockets to ignite them, so we don't have that issue or anything. I should say, none of the pyrotechnics are connected in the way they need to be in the solid rocket boosters to actually ignite them today. So we cannot have an accidental ignition of the solids. And nor could we have an accidental ignition of the RS-25.
Right.
So that's a great question.
Right. We won't get so the specific answer is neither of those things are planned to happen, and really can't happen in this test. So we'll never get down to zero, and the vehicle's also not armed, figuratively armed, so that it could fly. There's still some things that it needs to go back to the VAB. That's part of the work that they're going to be doing when they go back to the VAB to get it ready to fly, is to hook up, like Chris said, all of the systems that allow you to arm the vehicle to fire the boosters.
And this actually ties into another question. Excuse me. Another question that has come through here asking, will they fire the engines? No, this is a wet dress rehearsal, not a static fire test. We know the core stage went through an engine firing test at Green Run and Stennis. There's not a planned static fire at the pad. The next time that those engines light will be for the actual launch. But,
and in fact, there is no plan to ever do a hot fire test on SLS ever again. That was only going to end up being for core stage 1. Even though the original plan was to send all the core stages to Stennis and hot fire them, that has been banned.
Right, yeah. Chat saying the movie Space Camp lied to us? Yes, it did.
In many ways.
In many ways. Another question here. Vinchu, thank you for the super chat support. Does the SLS have an estimated launch date? Will SLS go back to the VAB after the dress rehearsal? We touched on this earlier, so I'll recap. Yes, SLS is going back to the VAB for sure. It will hopefully only make one trip back to the VAB because it will go back, get prepared for launch, and then go. Philip mentioned that the amount of work between a successful wet dress and a launch attempt is somewhere around a month or so, but it does depend on the data that they get back from the finished wet dress rehearsal, so it's a very rough timeline. So as far as the estimated launch date, a month or so after wet dress is finished, and then it will go back to the VAB. Ideally, it will only go back to the VAB once, but they could say if they have to cut wet dress testing short and they're still testing, they could say, like they did last time, go back to the VAB to troubleshoot something, then bring it back out and do another wet dress attempt. But hopefully that's not the case, and we're not anywhere near there yet right now. Right now, they're just making a hydrogen leak issue that could result in a recycle after detanking, but not necessarily a rollback. So that's the current status.
The only thing that's the current earlier than launch window target is the August one, the full August one. That's in late August. They have ruled out the late July into early August window, which leaves us with just the mid-late August window at this point. That's the earliest possible.
Other support that's coming here. We got a couple new memberships coming in here from Hazel, so thank you for your support there. Also, PBJ Spoon, thank you for the membership as well as Ben. All of you, thank you so much for your membership. If you enjoy the perks, and we appreciate this. Some more questions that have come in here. AV99 asks, what are those black squares on the boosters? Those are optical markers for test objectives. Do we have some more detail into what exactly those will be used for?
They're used for. There are cameras. It's I don't know if we have I don't have the close-up engine shot, but you can actually see a couple of them on the core stage. You see in the middle, the core stage is in the middle of the picture in terms of the vehicle. You see the checkerboard in the middle of the core stage, and then to the left, to the right, you see these white. They're cameras that are facing up the stack. There are cameras all over the core stage that will be streaming back to the ground when the vehicle's flying. And one of the major objectives that they want to get from a video standpoint is the dynamic motion of the boosters when they separate. They want to make sure that there's the amount of clearance they're predicting aerodynamically up at that altitude. And so these checkerboards give them fixed reference points that they can use when they're looking at the video, assuming there's enough light, if it's a lighted launch. But assuming that you have enough light to see the checkerboards on the core stage, they know where the cameras are relative to relative positions on the core stage. They know where the checkerboards are relative those positions on the boosters before they separate. And so then you can use those photogrammetry markings to map the motion of the boosters after separation. So you can barely see the aft booster attach points to the core stage. You can see the one we're actually looking at the backside of the vehicle, so the left-hand booster is actually on the right here. But they have those bolts will be blown by pyrotechnic devices, and then there are separation motors, which are also we can't see them here. They're on the opposite sides of the boosters. But those motors will fire immediately after the bolts are cut between the core stage and the boosters. And then the boosters basically just fall away from the vehicle, and the separation motors are going to try and push them away. And so this is the first time they're flying this vehicle. These are longer boosters than Shuttle. It's a longer sustainer stage and a different configuration than Shuttle. So they want to make sure that they have at least as much clearance, not just that you have a recontact, but that the boosters actually, the separation dynamics are more or less as they predict them in aerodynamic models. So this will basically give them, you can't call it ground truth, but this will give them flight data that they can compare to their aerodynamic models.
Flight truths,
Right. But yeah, and you can see below the boosters here, you can see checkerboards on the hold down posts. And so they're going to do some similar, and you can actually see it down here under the red Firex. You can see one that's an engineering camera. They have film cameras, high-speed film cameras and high-speed video cameras. They'll be using those photogrammetry markings also to map out the vehicle.
Florida for the Artemis 1 wet press rehearsal. Got an update here. The launch team. The liquid hydrogen team is done troubleshooting this hydrogen leak in the quick disconnect line between the rocket and the tail service mast. It's a leaky seal on the rocket side, and so now they're working on some proposals. One recommendation they have, but this is just a recommendation at this point, is to see if they can get as far as possible into terminal count. And the way they want to do that is they want to put the hydrogen core stage back into replenish. It's actually down to 94% right now because of boil off after they hit stop flow during the troubleshooting. And so they want to put that into replenish to bring it back up to the flight level in time for terminal count. And they've been talking strategy and running scenarios in firing room 3 to see what they need to do to get through terminal count. And one of the ideas, and I want to emphasize these are ideas and proposals at this point, is to make an adjustment to where the launch computer doesn't see the hydrogen leak and then start terminal count. And then what's being proposed and what's being discussed, try to get down into around the T-1 minute 30 mark. But again, the hydrogen team is still working on this proposal. They went to the launch director, Charlie Blackwell Thompson, to get permission to go and work that, and she did approve. So that's what they're looking at now. They've got to bring it back. They've got to refine it, continue to work it, and bring it back to her. And so that's what we're waiting on right now. We don't have a T0 as a result of that. And so the team is standing by. At this point, if this were a launch, this would be a time for the team to work, but we're all obviously extended through the original 30-minute window. And because this isn't a launch, right, because we don't have to rendezvous with the moon, the launch director is allowing her team to work. So we'll see what the team comes up with, and we'll keep you updated. This is Artemis Launch Control.
Okay, so the latest update ties right into a question we had earlier where we were talking about could this hydrogen leak be worked around and still get further into testing. It sounds like teams are, and again, he emphasized many times that this was a proposal, but it sounds like it is possible that they may be able to adjust their terminal count procedures to get a few more testing done despite that persistent hydrogen leak, which would be good because then you will no longer have to do a full D-tank, get out there, fix the hydrogen leak before reaching those test objectives. More objectives, obviously, you can check off at a given test, the better. So it sounds like that is a potential path forward, but they are still working on finalizing that plan and whether it's feasible. So we'll have to stay tuned to see if they actually choose to go down that.
Yeah, it also would indicate that the leak is not big. Whatever it is not big. Because they would, if this were a significant leak, this would not be. And they would not be saying, "Yeah, just let it keep leaking and let's take out the computer so it doesn't see it and just go for it." Like they wouldn't be saying that if it were significant. So it does shed some light on potentially like it's leaking, but it's leaking at such a low amount that it's like barely violating your part per million count limits or something like that. And maybe since we're not igniting engines today and we don't flash source, we're okay to keep going. But I want to stress a couple of things that you heard in there. The team came to Charlie with the proposal, and Charlie didn't say, "Yeah, that's good." Charlie went, "Yeah, go back and keep working on that plan and come back to me."
Right.
So she did not outright approve it, which is also very, very important to note. But
they have the full. This is the entire management team is here. So they're this is sort of practice like you fly. So the mission management team has they gave the go to begin tanking at the beginning of the day. So they're still there, and they will. These are the right people. They have everybody they need to talk to about this. So a couple of things. I don't think we mentioned this in the broadcast itself, but. They actually did change. So he mentioned Daryl Nail, the NASA commentator, public affairs officer, mentioned that this was the flight side quick disconnect, and it's this is a system that was changed after the green run. They actually replaced the line and made it replaced it with a line that has a slightly larger diameter. And so this actually was not hardware that was run at Green Run. So it's possible maybe that we're seeing something here. Again, this is behavior. This is new behavior on the flight side. But then stepping back big picture, I think, I guess the theory is, or the strategy is probably a better way of putting it, is they know the engines have a lot of flight experience. They're not flying today. They're not going to, as we've been talking about, they're not going to fire the engines. The engine bleed is only, I don't want to use the word necessary, but they don't necessarily need to. I used it anyway. They don't necessarily need the engines to be in the start box today, because they're not going to fire them. This test is primarily to test the ground systems, that the ground systems can fuel the rocket, that the ground systems can sequence the countdown all the way down, to those cutoff points that we're talking about. And, listening to the way that they're talking about this, if they did approve this plan, I really think, and then actually be able to pull it off, which is another question. I would not be surprised if they have the discussion of, is this good enough to call, does this satisfy enough of our test objectives for this test to, like we were talking about, just say, okay, we'll roll it back to the VAB, we'll fix this bleed valve on the core stage in the VAB, and then we'll come back out for launch when we're ready to do that with all of the other, they'll find other issues here in this countdown. But what's interesting to me is it sounds like they're talking about a possible path to finish this test today. They may not actually be able to pull it off, but that's what it sounds like they're talking about to me. And like Chris said, they may go to the mission management team with this proposal, but that doesn't mean that the mission management team is going to approve it.
Right. And Philip, there was one other thing I caught, and I'm wondering if this is a change or if I'm just or where, when they do the initial run into the count, Daryl from NASA Public Affairs just said count to 90 seconds. He just said count down to 1 minute 30. My memory of that was that the first run through Greenwood was going to go down to 33 seconds, hold at that handoff point, and then cut off there, recycle, and then they would come back and do the run down to like 9.34. And that first run to 33 seconds would involve a terminal count hold after you pick up the count at 10, hold for like 3 minutes at 4 minute mark, and then count down to 33, hold, cut off, recycle to demonstrate that, then come back. Do I have that right, or was the plan to always just go down to 90 seconds for the first one? Because if not, that timing has changed.
No, you had it right. They were gonna, for the first run, they have this 3 minute hold. The test objective, which was to accumulate 3 minutes of hold time somewhere up to the 90-second point, and then pick up, run down to 33, hold, cut off. So you had that right. I think the issue perhaps is, again, I'm thinking of shuttle days, but the engine ready indications, I believe, are inside that 90-second point. And so, again, given the time constraints, and given that they, if they're not going to do the engine bleed and the full engine chill down, it's possible that might be as far down as they can get. That would exercise the ground side of the terminal countdown sequence all the way up to that hold point, and that hold point is where they would transition from ground power to vehicle internal power on the core stage. But again, like I said, I don't know. This sounds pretty ambitious to me. This plan. Pardon me, but this would take them. They would be able to verify that the ground system can pressurize all of the propellant tanks in the core stage and I believe the ICPS. Possible not, but I do think that the ICPS is a much smaller rocket stage, and I don't think they're really worried about. I think they're worried about getting a sequencing on the core stage. So if we go through those again, you have pressurizing the core stage tanks, which starts inside 6 minutes. Then you have the core stage APUs that we were talking about earlier. That is a ground-based helium spin start system. They start energizing that at 5 minutes, and then they spin the core stage APUs up on helium beginning at 4 minutes. They'll do the engine thrust vector control They do a canned gimbal profile. They would do that test at 2 minutes 30 seconds. And so what they would not get is they would not get the handoff from the ground sequencer to the core stage flight computers. They wouldn't get the autonomous launch sequence, which begins at 30 seconds. And so, again, the core stage at Stennis did not have the boosters attached to it. They did not have the ICPS attached to it, but they have exercised that software to a great degree in past tests. And so I can see them. I can see the strategy here, but again, it is absolutely worth cautioning. It's just a proposal. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do this, but I don't know if they have to scrub, turn around, and come back again and do another test. I don't know how much value there is in getting one run, one terminal countdown run in, because again, if they find issues in that before they get down to 90, or they pick up a bunch of issues when they're going down to 90, you would think, well, what do are you gonna fix just those and not fix the hydrogen leak? So anyway, it'll be interesting to see if they do decide to go ahead and proceed with this sort of an abbreviated test. And if they do that and they're able to get all the way down to 90 seconds, whether they would consider that to satisfy enough test objectives to say, okay, we have enough information to say that we can the next time we feel this vehicle would be for launch. That's pretty ambitious, but it sounds like they're talking about something like that, or at least steps on that path.
So yeah, we'll keep an eye on what the decision actually gets made, and of course, it's all, even no matter what path they take today, what really matters is what the data analysis afterwards looks like, however many objectives they were able to check off, and then what's left to prove before being able to declare the rocket launch ready.
And a thing that we haven't really touched on that's really quick is just because, like, let's say this works, right? Let's say this plan today works, right? And they do get to 90 seconds and they get all that. That does not preclude them from saying, great, we learned a lot. We're going to try it again in 3 days. I mean,
right,
nothing precludes them from coming in and saying, that was good, we want to do it again.
Yeah, the getting down to 90 seconds or so today is definitely preferred to stopping short and having to call it here, even if it still means you come back for yet another wet dress in a few days, because you were going to go fix that hydrogen leak seal and the other issues that you learn of during the terminal count, and then you could get one more countdown through that maybe it goes through even smoother, and that gives you that much more confidence going into the launch.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And as an example, this issue, this hydrogen leak that we're seeing, it's possible that's been there for a while, and it's only because we got to this point today that we were able that they were able to uncover it, so to speak. And so, like you said, there's some value in continuing down as far as you can. They may find if the sooner that they find that they learn some of these issues, the better. It just gives them more data, like you said, that they can consider in terms of where do we go next from here.
Right. We're going to keep some questions coming here. We've got a whole queue of questions still, so we're going to keep those coming. I've also got some super chats that I've been sending on here. I want to get through these as well. There's your rapid fire. Thank you for all the support, Ramesh. Asking, do you still think they have to go into the VAB? Well, we know we have to go to the VAB at least once because the final launch preparations require a rollback and rollout. But we are hoping that it is only one trip to the VAB and not a trip to correct wet dress issues, roll back out for another wet dress, and then roll back for the launch preps. That's very much to be determined, but hopefully only one trip to the VAB in the future for this particular rocket. Thanks for the support. Our very own Patrick wants to know, what are the 4 tanks for? Those are for holding the propellants, like we've been talking about today, and they differ from the 4 towers, even though there's only 3 towers, unless you count the ML. I guess that's the 4th tower. But thank you, Patrick, for your support. Rough Riders Show with a question: if this was a launch attempt, it would already be a scrub, right? Given that they only have a 2-hour launch window each attempt. No. So the simulated launch window for today, I think you said right around 4:40, right, Philip?